Hey, this is Brent, and today I want to go through the Update the UI with State, which is in the Develop in Swift tutorials, and it's over here in the Swift UI section, and it's specifically the buttons and state, and it's called Update the UI with State. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's open Xcode and create a new project. Here we want to give it a name, and we're going to call this Dice Roller, and we'll have these settings for SwiftUI and Swift. Choose Next, and we'll save it where we got our other projects. Go ahead and click Create. First thing we want to do is create a new SwiftUI view file. So over here, on the folder, I'm going to right click and then I'm going to choose New File from Template. And we want to select Swift UI View, choose Next, and let's call this Dice View. Go ahead and click Return. Let's replace this text with an image. And we'll say System Name. Remember, with autocomplete, you can press Tab and get the autocomplete. And in our case, it's die.face.1. And here you can see a little dice listed there. Notice with this SF symbol, you've got a number at the end, and so you can change it, and that changes the face of the die that's shown for the image. Fun fact, the little dots that are on the dice are called pips. So let's create a variable, and we want to call this, we'll say var number of pips. And it's a type of int, and we'll set it to 1. And then from here, we can use string interpolation to replace this number here with the value of the number of pips. So if I delete the 3 and then I put backslash and then an open parentheses and then I say number of pips and then I press tab and it auto completes, and then notice how it's there. It now shows the 1. Of course, it's a little real tiny. We'll fix that here in a second. But if I change the number of pips, to 4, then all of a sudden it updates the image because we're replacing this string value with the value of the number that's represented there. If you've followed along on the previous videos, you've noticed that we've created properties on various views. And in our case, when we use the var keyword and we set a value, we have what's called a default value. So here we're initializing a variable called number of pips, and it's a type of int, and we set equals and then a value. What we've done is we've set a default value. Whenever you do that, because it's set as a default value, notice that we don't get an error. If we had set this as an empty value, then in the preview, it would expect that you pass in a value for the argument. But in our case, because we've set a default value, we don't need to do that. The other difference is we're using a var keyword instead of let, because this value will change over time. Let's add some modifiers to our image so that we can see it a little better. If we set to resizable, and I press tab, notice it's going to fill all of the available space. Now, that's a little big, so we want to set a frame. And in order to set the frame so that it matches what we want, we say frame. And then from here, we'll say width. And the width we can set to 100, and then a comma, and then height. Press tab, and then the value we'll set is 100. And so now we have set the frame to 100 by 100. And so we can, because we set a frame, it constrains it to that area. But because we set it resizable, then that image will scale to whatever the frame changes, so we can change that dynamically. We'll see it here in a little bit. When the container changes size, the image will reflect that size as well. Let's go ahead and embed the image in a VStack. So you click on the image keyword and then you right click and choose embed, and then it fills in and we can type VStack, and I press tab and now we're embedded in a VStack. So now we can add additional items, and in our case we want to add a button. Let's type button and open parentheses, and notice that we've got a lot of options here. In the tutorial it says to select the one that references title key, and actually it's now been updated to title resource. So the autocomplete we want is this title resource and action, and so if we press that and then press return, now it's asking for a string, so we can replace that with roll. And then the action is a closure, and so this is the abbreviation for closure, that it's expecting to return nothing is what this means, return void, but it's expecting a closure. If I press return right now, then you're going to see it fills in the brackets, and now we have code. So now we can enter code in here, and this is referred to as the action of the button. So we've created a button, we've given it a title, and then we now have an action. So whenever the button is clicked, it does something. In our case, what we want to do is have, when you press the button, we want it to randomly update the number of pips. And so we can do that by typing number of pips, press tab, equals, and there's a method on the int that's called random. And from here we can say random in, and then it's asking for a range. And a range is basically a beginning and end of numbers, a range of integers. So in our case, we're going to start with 1. And if you use 3 dots, 1, 2, 3, and then the last number, then that's the range. So what we're doing is we're getting an error. We'll talk about that here in a second. But we're getting a random number between 1 and 6, including 1 and 6. So when you have these 3 dots, that is a shortcut for a range. And so we're saying we want a random number that is from 1 to 6. Now, the error, if we take a look at that, it says cannot assign to property. It says, cannot assign to property. And then it says self is immutable. We fix this by adding a prefix called state. So we put the @ symbol and then state and then a space, and then we set it to private. So the way this works is, in order for the view to get updated based on the value of this property, we have to use the keyword state, and it's this the @ symbol state. Whenever you have a state variable on a view, you want to set it to private so that only the view and its child views have access to this property. We don't want an external view that's not related to this making that change. So whenever we create a state variable, it is set to private. The other reason we set it as a state is because now when this value changes, SwiftUI will automatically redraw the screen with the value that has changed. And so it's listening for this variable, and anytime this variable changes, it's going to update the screen for us. Notice the error went away. Let's go ahead and click the roll button, and notice it changes. And occasionally you'll notice that the value looks like it doesn't change, but again, because you only have 6 digits, it could randomly pick the same number. So here we're seeing all these different values change. Let's apply some styles to the button. At the end of the button, press return and then type button style and then dot, and you've got all sorts of options, but we want the bordered. And so now we have this background on the button. We can use an animation that's available to us for any Swift UI view. Whenever the state changes, we can have it change using an animation style. And in order to do that, we can select this code and then right click and choose embed. And then we want to say with animation. Now, if you press return on there, it's going to add it. We want to delete that. So what we're using is this closure, which is in these curly braces. So now when this changes, you're going to see it animate. So if I click roll, notice it fades in and fades out. Fades out the old and fades in the new. So now we've added that. And then there's there's modifiers you can add. That'll be for another video, but just know that if you want the UI to change with an animation, that whenever it gets updated, it does a certain type of animation, you would enclose this around the code that changes the state variable that you're wanting to change. And so in our case, we wrap number of pips with animation, and then it updates every time with a sweet animation. So far we've been working with our dice view, which is a very specific view that has the die and the button. Let's go to the content view, which is kind of the opening screen, and let's remove this stuff that's in the VStack, delete that, and let's create a text that is dice roller. Let's give this a modifier to change the font size. So we're going to say font, and then within this font we're going to say dot large title dot lowercase small caps. And what that does is we're combining modifiers, and notice how the text now says dice roller, so it's capital, but with the lower cases are capitals as well. Next, let's add an H stack. So below the text, we're going to say H stack, and we're going to say dice view, and we're going to add a couple of those. Let's do 3. And then notice that it adds them to the view, and you can interact with them and see the animation and everything. Rather than hard coding the number of dice views that we want in here, we're going to use a new view, and it's called for each. So for each, and then we're going to open parenthesis, and we're going to pass in a value. So we're going to do a range. So 1 dot 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 3 comma, and then ID space, and then backslash dot description, and then open curly brace, and then a space, and then an underscore, and then in, and then from here we've got dice view, and let's talk about this for a second. So this for each is a type of view, and what it does is it dynamically creates whatever code is in here, which is referencing another view that you're adding. So it dynamically adds these views based on this code up here. And what we're doing is we're saying between 1 and 3, that's how many we want to show on the screen. And so then this information here, we're not going to worry about at the moment, but just understand that it needs an ID, which in our case, we're referencing the description. And then whenever you use an underscore, the underscore just means that it's expecting a variable name. And we'll see this again in later tutorials. But for now, just understand that the underscore just means that we don't have to reference anything. I don't have to use a variable. And then the in is for every one of these, whatever action we're taking, for each one of those, we're going to create a dice view. And so basically the for each says for every number of times this indicates, I'm going to create a dice view. Right now we've hard coded or we've statically written these values like it won't change as the program runs. In order for it to dynamically change, we need to add a state property, and we're going to call this. So again, remember when you use a state property, you use the at and then the keyword state. And then again, it's a private var number of dice. And we're going to call this an integer, and then we're going to set a default value, and it's going to be of 1. Now to use this, we want to change. Notice that we have to have a range, and in our case, we're going to say from 1 to number of dice. And so now that value changes here, but if I change the value to 5, for example, then we're going to get 5 views. Now, notice right away something is not quite right. We're going to fix this in a minute, but just be aware that we're now dynamically changing the number of dice that we show on the screen based on this state variable called number of dice. Let's go ahead and set that back to 1. Below this H stack, we want to add another H stack, and we're going to add some buttons. So here we're going to type H stack, open curly brace, and then we want to add a button. And for the button, we're going to say remove dice for the text. And then inside the action block, we want to say number of dice, and I press tab to autocomplete, and then a space. Then I'm going to do minus equals 1. I'm going to talk about this in 1 second. Let's go ahead and add one more button, and we'll call it add dice for the text, and then open curly brace, and here we're going to say number of dice plus equals 1. This minus equals and plus equals is a shorthand for taking the value of this variable and then subtracting 1 from it, or in our case here, we're taking the value of number of dice and we're adding 1 to it. If you take a look over here at the buttons, if I click the add button, add dice will continue to add dice. And then I can remove, and then notice what happens when I clicked remove. All of a sudden we got a crash, and yeah, it didn't like that. The reason it crashed is because the number of dice went down below 0, so -1, and the reason it's crashing is because in the for each, we're going from 1 to, and you can't go to 0 or a negative number because it's expecting a range from a number 1 to a number higher than 1. So that's why it crashed. In order to fix that, what we want to do is disable the button when the value of number of dice equals 1. And the way to do that is there's a property on the button which is called .disabled, and it takes a Boolean, meaning yes or no, true or false. And in this case, what we're saying is number of dice equals 1. So when the property number of dice equals 1, then we say it's disabled, which means it's true. Then the button is disabled. So let's go ahead and refresh the preview, and notice that the button is currently disabled because when we start the application, the number of dice is 1. So let's go ahead and add another dice. And so now notice that the remove dice is active, and now it's disabled as soon as it hits 1. So now that'll prevent this from crashing. Also notice that we're using a double equals sign, and this is saying it's a comparison from this side to this side, and so it's comparing. If number of dice is equal to 1, then it resolves to true. Because we have an add dice, and notice that the screen currently we're not set up to handle more than 3. Let's go ahead and disable the add dice button if the value, we're going to say disabled, and we're going to say if number of dice equals 3, then it's going to disable that button. So notice now, once I hit 3, then it's disabled. So that's one way you can control the actions based on enabling or disabling a button. We can also animate the changes of whenever there's a number, or the dice are added. because this is a state variable, we can animate the changes that occur as a result of this state variable. And so we can take this and right click and choose embed, and we can say with animation, press tab, and then press delete to delete the code hinting, because we just want this closure with the curly braces. And we can do the same thing here, right click embed, and we can say with animation. Now when we add a dice, notice how it animates. It animates over and fades in. And then we remove it, it also animates it. Pretty cool. Let's update some things so that we can see more than just 3 dice on the screen. So if we change the number of dice, we can update that to now say 5. So as we add more, we'll get up to 5 dice. Now this is not working properly, so we need to fix it. We want to pin this preview. So right now we're in the content view, which is the main application screen, but we need to make changes to the dice, the individual dice view. And in order to see those changes, we can pin the preview. And so notice you can make some updates. You'll see that. Now let's switch over to the dice view, and let's update this so that as we add more, it's going to resize properly. One way we can do this so that the images are resized as they are added to the screen is part of frame. You can have what is called a max width. If I delete that and I type that, and I can say max height. Now, as you add more dice, this is going to shrink to fit. Now, the only problem is, notice that it's shrinking, but it's shrinking horizontally. It's not maintaining the nice square dice that we're expecting. In order to fix that, you can actually pass another modifier to the image, which is aspect ratio. An aspect ratio, we pass in a value, and so before the content mode we're going to say 1, comma, and then the content mode is dot fit. And now when we add more dice, notice it shrinks and it maintains the aspect ratio, meaning the height and the width stay the same and they're modified together. And then when we say content mode fit, it just means that the image won't need to fill the available space. It'll take up as much space as it can, both width and height being the same. Now let's go back to the content view. We can unpin this, go back to content view, and let's update the styles of our buttons. On the button, we can have an argument that passes in an image. So if I go to the add dice, and after the string, after that quotation mark, I can press comma, space, and then pass in system image, which is another argument. And here we're going to pass in the plus dot circle dot fill. Now notice it adds a image, but it also keeps the text. So to change that, we can set a style on the button called label style. Now, because we have 2 buttons, we want the same style applied to both buttons. If you add the property to the H stack, and I noticed in the tutorial it had added some padding, so let's go ahead and add padding while we're here. And then press return, and then we have dot label style. And the label style is dot icon only. So now it's showing the icon only. It's important to keep the text, even though visually you're not seeing the text, because people who rely on voiceover in order to navigate, they want to hear the descriptive text associated with all the visual elements on the screen. And so it's a good practice to use the text even though we're doing icon only, in order for it to work well for those who need it. Let's also add a font style to increase the button image size. So we're going to say dot font and then set it to title. And notice changes the image larger. And then finally, let's add the system image to the remove dice button. So right after the quotation marks, press comma and then type system image and press tab. And then here we're going to call minus.circle.fill. And notice, remember, the button is disabled when it starts, and so that's the disabled, it's grayed out for the image. Next, we want to make some other style changes. In our case, we want to add a background. And in order to do that, we're going to create a new color set. And you remember from previous tutorials, we come over here to the assets folder, and then we click the plus and we choose color set. We'll give this a name. We're going to say app background. And then we want to change, set the color and set some properties. So over here we want to see the inspector. And remember, for appearance we can say none, because we want this to apply regardless of whether they have dark or light enabled on their device. And then finally we need to select the color object and set that. From the tutorial, it's set to 0.208. Press tab and then 0.478. Press tab and then it's 0.613. Press tab. So that's the color that we want. Now if we go back to content view, we can close the inspector, give ourselves a little more space. And then down here at the bottom, here we're on the V stack of the application. After the padding, we want to add a property called background. And we're going to say .app background, and that's the new value color that we added. And then finally, we want to set the tint for the colors to be .white. How about we spell it right? Tint. There we go. Now currently we're not seeing it expanded as we should, so we'll fix that. We'll set a frame after the padding, and we'll say .frame, and we'll do the max width, and we're going to set that to infinity. You remember from previous tutorials, when you use the keyword infinity, then it sets to all the available space. Infinity. And if I spell infinity right, it'll work. All right, there you go. Let's also change the text, the title text. We'll set the foreground style to white. Let's fix the colors for the dice image. So let's go to the dice view, and if you look at there's a property on the SF symbols, and in our case we want it to be filled in, and so after where it says die.face and then number of pips, at the end of that, before that last quotation mark, we want to put .fill. Then it's going to fill that in. Now we want to change the color. We'll set the foreground style, and we'll set it to white. Now, the nature of these symbols is, in our case, the image itself is white, but the pips, the little dots, are actually transparent. We can actually pass in multiple values and set what's called a primary color and a secondary color. And if you pass in another value, so if we say dot black and then a comma and then a space, then it will pass in and modify the image, because one of these is the primary color and the other is a secondary color. Now there's a lot to do with the way that SF symbols are stylized, and so you'll have to look that up. The human interface guidelines referenced from the tutorial has a lot more information, but basically there's different elements within each image and the different modifiers will have a different effect. So that's something you can look into. All right, let's check it out. Let's see how it looks in our content view. And we've already created, so now we can add multiple dice, up to 5 dice. We can remove them and we can roll the dice. Check that out. Sweet. All right, that's it for this video. Let's take a look at the tutorial and check out the questions. Let's check your understanding. So here, let's scroll down to the end. Check out what it has to say. Select the true statement about view state. Swift UI automatically updates a view when the value of any of its state properties changes. You mark state properties with the public keyword. You can change the value of a view's state property from outside the view. So these are false, and the reason for that is we set the state property as private because we don't want outside views changing the state property. So this one, SwiftUI automatically updates the view. That is correct. So go ahead and click submit. And yep, very good. Choose the correct button code. Here you've got button, you've got text, and then you have the enclosure. Now, notice these two are similar, but what is different? Well, the difference is it's actually curly braces. The curly brace is the enclosure, or sorry, the closure for that property. So we go ahead and click submit, and so it says a closure contains code in braces. Next question. How do you disable a button? Then you have a disabled property, but you have to pass in a value. And so the modifier is called disabled, and then you have to pass in a value of true to disable that button. Very good. Awesome. You did great. Thanks for following along. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share with everybody you know. I appreciate it, and we'll see you in the next video.